Before we begin, happy holidays to everyone listening. Whether you're spending time with family, travelling, or just enjoying some downtime with a mystery story, we're grateful you're here. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us. And if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that refuse to stay buried, hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get into tonight's story. Imagine dying in the snow, not from a fall, not from an animal attack, not from getting lost. Imagine something so terrifying that you would rather freeze to death in the darkness than stay in the safety of your shelter. February 1959, the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. A landscape so hostile that the local Mansi people called one peak Dead Mountain. 9 experienced hikers set up camp on its slopes. They were young, skilled, and prepared for the worst nature could throw at them. By morning they were running for their lives. 9 bodies would be found scattered across that frozen mountainside over the following months. Some near a cedar tree, desperately trying to start a fire with frozen fingers. Others at the bottom of a ravine, bones shattered by forces that shouldn't exist in an accident. 2 making their way back to the tent they'd fled, dying meters from shelter. Their tent was found still standing, sliced open from the inside with deliberate cuts. Inside, boots lined up neatly, coats hung on poles, supplies organised, everything you'd need to survive, everything they chose to leave behind. The injuries on the bodies defied explanation. Massive internal trauma with no external wounds, broken ribs without bruises, fractured skulls without cuts, one victim missing her tongue and eyes, another with radiation detected on his clothing. The official investigation lasted 3 months before being abruptly classified. The conclusion, written in the careful language of bureaucrats who know they're lying, called it a compelling natural force. No details, no specifics, just nature. But what if the truth was something the Soviet Union could never admit? What if those 9 hikers didn't die because they were unlucky? What if they died because, on that freezing February night, they walked into something they were never supposed to see? What if they became witnesses to a weapons test that wasn't supposed to have witnesses? Tonight, we're going deep into Operation Snowblind. Not just another retelling of the Dyatlov Pass incident, but an investigation into the conspiracy theory that won't die. The theory that says this wasn't a tragedy of nature, but a cover-up of a weapons test gone catastrophically wrong. A theory built on classified documents, witness reports of orange lights in the sky, radiation that shouldn't have been there, and injuries that match experimental weapons better than they match avalanches or hypothermia. We're going to walk through the evidence, piece by piece. The things that don't add up, the files that disappeared, the questions that were never answered, because asking them was dangerous. Because if this theory is true, if 9 students died as collateral damage in a secret military program, then their deaths weren't the tragedy. The tragedy was the lie that followed, the systematic erasure of truth to protect a weapons program that valued secrecy over human life. And the most disturbing part? It might have worked. For 60 years the official story has held. Until now. Chapter 1. The Hikers. To understand what happened on that mountain, you need to know who these people were. Because the official narrative, the story that gets repeated in documentaries and Wikipedia articles, wants you to believe they were reckless, that they made mistakes, that they panicked for no reason, that this was fundamentally their fault. They weren't amateurs, and this wasn't their fault. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old, an engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, now called Yekaterinburg. He wasn't just some kid looking for adventure on a winter break. He was methodical, experienced, respected by both his professors and his peers. He'd led multiple winter expeditions before this one, each more challenging than the last. His classmates described him as cautious to a fault, the kind of person who triple-checked equipment and planned for every contingency. He kept detailed journals of every trip, weather observations, route notes, equipment performance, the kind of documentation that engineers love and that would later prove he knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't Igor's first time in the Northern Urals. He'd been there the previous winter. He knew the terrain, knew the weather patterns, knew the risks. If anything, he was overqualified for a Grade 3 certification trek. With him were 8 others, carefully selected. This wasn't a random group of friends. Each person brought specific skills and experience to the expedition. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, was a radio engineering student. Quiet, competent, known for staying calm under pressure. He'd grown up in the Urals and had been hiking these mountains since he was a teenager. He understood the cold in a way that people from warmer climates never could. Yuri Krivanashenko, 23, had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility, one of the Soviet Union's most important and most dangerous nuclear sites. He was a joker, always lightening the mood, but also deeply experienced in winter survival. The fact that he'd worked at Mayak would become significant later, when radiation was found on clothing from the scene. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, was studying radio engineering. Friends called her Zina. She was known for her endurance, her ability to keep moving when others wanted to quit. She'd completed several difficult winter expeditions and had earned a reputation as someone who could be counted on when conditions got bad. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, was an economics student, but her real passion was hiking. She'd been doing winter expeditions since her teenage years. Small, tough, relentless. The kind of person who would hike through a blizzard with a smile. Her friends later said she was fearless, which makes what happened to her body particularly disturbing. Rustam Slobodin, 23, had graduated with an engineering degree and was working while continuing to hike. He was experienced, steady, someone you wanted on your team when things went wrong. He'd survived difficult situations before and always kept his head. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, was a physics student. Serious, focused, intellectually curious. He approached hiking the way he approached science, with careful observation and logical thinking. His family would later say he never did anything without understanding all the variables. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, was a construction engineer with French ancestry, which made his hyphenated surname stand out in Soviet Russia. He was strong, capable, and had extensive winter experience. His engineering background meant he understood structures, stress points, and how things fail under pressure. And then there was Semyon Zolotaryov, 38 years old, a World War II veteran and the oldest member of the group by nearly 15 years. He'd asked to join the expedition at the last minute, replacing someone who had dropped out. His background was vague, his records incomplete, and his presence would later fuel some of the darker theories about what really happened. Their goal was straightforward: reach a Torton mountain, about 50 kilometers north, and complete a winter trek that would earn them a Grade 3 hiking certification. This was the highest level available in the Soviet Union, a certification that took years of experience to qualify for. This wasn't a casual camping trip. It was a serious mountaineering expedition by people who had dedicated years to mastering winter survival. They left Sverdlovsk on January 23, 1959. 10 people initially, though one, Yuri Yudin, would turn back early due to illness, a decision that probably saved his life. The remaining 9 continued north by train, then by truck, then on skis into the wilderness. Everything was documented. Supplies checked and rechecked. Route planned with alternate paths in case of bad weather. Emergency protocols established. They carried enough food for the entire journey plus extra. Their equipment was inspected by experienced hikers who certified it as appropriate for the conditions. They were supposed to send a telegram when they returned, no later than February 12th. They'd promised their families, they'd promised the university. It was standard procedure for expeditions like this. That telegram never came. On February 20th, when no one had heard from the group for over a week past their expected return, search teams were organised. Volunteers, mostly other students and experienced hikers, headed into the mountains. They expected to find the group delayed by weather, maybe dealing with an injury, but fundamentally okay. What they found instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Chapter 2. The Night They Fled the Tent. February 1st, 1959. The last night anyone can confirm the group was alive. the last entry in their journals, the last photographs on their cameras. What happened that night has been reconstructed from evidence found weeks later by search teams, and the picture it paints makes absolutely no sense if you believe in accidents or natural disasters. The tent was found on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, a mountain whose name translates from the local Mansi language as Dead Mountain. Already an ominous name, and one that would prove grimly appropriate. The location was partway up the slope, not at the summit, not in a valley, but on exposed terrain where wind would be constant and shelter minimal. When searchers found it on February 26th, nearly 4 weeks after the hikers had died, the tent was still standing. Not collapsed, not buried, still held up by its poles, weighed down by snow but structurally intact. From a distance, it looked like the group might still be inside, just sleeping, but they weren't. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Long, vertical slashes through heavy canvas, not ripped by wind or torn by the weight of snow, cut deliberately with a knife or sharp tool by someone trying to get out fast. Multiple cuts, suggesting either multiple people cutting at once, or one person making sure they had enough room to escape. Think about that decision for a moment. You're in a tent designed to protect you from temperatures that can kill you in minutes. You have a door, a functional exit, but instead of using it, you take out a knife and destroy your shelter. You cut holes in the only thing standing between you and death by exposure. Why would you do that? The only reason that makes sense is if opening the door would take too long, if whatever is outside is so immediate, so dangerous, that you can't spare the seconds it would take to unfasten the entrance. You need out now, and you need everyone out at the same time. Inside the tent, everything was in order, supplies neatly arranged, boots lined up against one wall, exactly where you'd place them to keep them from freezing solid. Coats hung on the internal frame, food stored properly, nothing scattered, nothing knocked over, no signs of struggle or panic before the cuts were made. This wasn't chaos. This was organisation interrupted by sudden terror, and everyone had left without their boots, without their winter coats, without the basic equipment you need to survive outside in conditions that night, had dropped to at least minus 25 degrees Celsius. That's minus 13 Fahrenheit. Cold enough to cause frostbite and expose skin within minutes. Cold enough to kill you in less than an hour if you're not properly dressed. These were experienced winter hikers. People who knew, intellectually and from hard experience, that leaving your shelter improperly clothed in those conditions was a death sentence. It wasn't a mistake they would make. It wasn't a decision they would take lightly. Yet they all did it. All 9 of them chose to run into the frozen darkness in their socks or bare feet rather than stay in their tent. There was no sign of struggle inside the tent, no damage to the supplies, no blood, no weapons. Whatever made them run, it didn't come from inside, it came from outside, and it was immediate enough that taking even a few extra seconds to grab boots was too dangerous. Searchers also found footprints leading away from the tent, preserved in snow that had been frozen solid for weeks. 8 or 9 sets of tracks made by people in socks or bare feet, heading downslope toward the tree line about 1.5 kilometers away. The footprints were measured, photographed, documented. They didn't show signs of running at first. They showed a measured pace, people walking deliberately, not panicked sprinting, not random fleeing, but purposeful movement away from the tent and down the mountain. Which raises another question. If they were fleeing in terror, why walk? Why not run? Unless whatever they were afraid of was above them, watching and running would attract attention. Or unless they were already injured and couldn't run. Or unless the threat wasn't immediate pursuit, but something else entirely. Something that required them to get distance from the tent, but didn't require panicked flight. The footprints continued for several hundred meters before the wind and subsequent snowfall erased them. But the direction was clear. Everyone left the tent together. Everyone headed toward the forest. And somewhere along that journey, the group began to separate. Search and rescue teams, when they found the tent, immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. Experienced hikers don't abandon shelter. They don't leave supplies. They don't go into the winter night unprepared unless the alternative is worse than certain death. So what could be worse than certain death from exposure? Chapter 3. The injuries that didn't add up. When the search teams found the bodies over the following weeks and months, spread across the mountainside in different locations at different distances from the tent. The autopsy reports created more questions than answers. The injuries documented by Soviet pathologists didn't just fail to match the official explanation, they created an entirely new mystery that has never been satisfactorily solved. The first two bodies were discovered on February 27th, 26 days after the hikers' last known night alive. They were found at the edge of the forest, about 1.5 kilometers from the tent, near a massive cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both wearing minimal clothing. Doroshenko was found in his underwear. Krivonishenko wore slightly more but was still woefully underdressed for the cold. Their hands told a story of desperation. Burned. Fingers blackened and blistered from trying to start or maintain a fire in temperatures that made every movement agony. The cedar tree itself bore evidence of their final struggle. Branches broken off up to 5 meters high, suggesting someone had climbed it, perhaps looking back toward the tent, perhaps searching for help that would never come, perhaps just trying to survive a few minutes longer. These two deaths made sense within the narrative of exposure, hypothermia, the cold-claiming victims who'd fled without proper protection. Exactly what you'd expect from people who ran into the winter night and couldn't make it back. But then came the others, and nothing made sense anymore. 3 more bodies were found on March 5th, spread out along the path between the cedar tree and the tent. It looked like they'd been trying to make their way back, trying to reach shelter, dying meters and meters from safety. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found face down in the snow, about 300 meters from the cedar tree. She'd made it farther than the 2 Yuris, but not far enough. Hypothermia. Exposure. The cold had taken her like it had taken the others. Igor Dyatlov, the leader, the careful planner, was found another 300 meters up the slope, still heading toward the tent, still trying. He'd almost made it halfway back before the cold stopped him forever. Rustem Slobodin was between them, also heading upslope. But his autopsy revealed something different, something that didn't fit the pattern. A skull fracture. Not severe enough to be immediately fatal, but significant. A crack in the bone. Evidence of impact. Of trauma. The pathologist noted it, but couldn't explain how it had happened. The terrain between the cedar tree and the tent was relatively clear. No rocks, no obvious obstacles, no evidence of a fall that would account for that kind of injury. Had he been struck by something? Had he fallen somehow? The report offered no answers. 4 bodies remained missing. Search teams scoured the area through March and into April. The snow began to melt and reveal terrain that had been buried. On May 4th, nearly 3 full months after the deaths, searchers made a discovery that would transform the case from mysterious to utterly inexplicable. A ravine beneath 4 meters of snow, and in that ravine, the final 4 bodies. This is where the conspiracy theory finds its strongest evidence. This is where the official explanations fall apart completely. Lyudmila Dubanina, the fearless economics student who loved hiking more than anything, was found with catastrophic chest trauma. Multiple rib fractures on both sides. The medical term is flail chest, a condition where so many ribs are broken that part of the chest wall moves independently during breathing. This is the kind of injury you see in high-speed car crashes when the steering wheel crushes the rib cage. It requires enormous force, the kind of force that leaves massive bruising, external damage, visible trauma. Lyudmila had almost none of that. Her skin was intact. No bruising over the fracture sites that would indicate external impact. No cuts. No abrasions. The damage was entirely internal. Bones shattered. Organs ruptured. But the exterior appeared almost normal. The pathologist, Boris Vozrojdeny, had been doing this work for decades. He'd seen victims of falls, of beatings, of industrial accidents. He knew what trauma looked like. And in his report, filed in May 1959, he wrote something remarkable. He compared the force required to cause Lyudmila's injuries to being hit by a car at high speed. He specifically stated that human force, a punch or a blow with a blunt weapon, could not account for the degree of internal trauma. He used the phrase extreme pressure multiple times, and in one note that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades, he wrote that the injuries were consistent with exposure to a powerful shockwave. A shockwave. Not a fall, not a fight, not an avalanche, a shockwave. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, the construction engineer with the French surname, had a major depressed skull fracture. Part of his skull had been pushed inward, bone fragments driven into his brain tissue. This was a fatal injury, the kind of trauma that would have killed him relatively quickly. But like Lyudmila, the external evidence didn't match. His scalp was intact. No cuts. No visible impact site. The damage was underneath, hidden, only revealed during autopsy. How do you fracture someone's skull without damaging the scalp? How does bone break and deform without the skin showing any sign of the force required? Alexander Kolevatov had a deformed neck noted in the autopsy without further explanation. His eyebrows were missing, a detail so strange it was recorded but never investigated. His injuries were less severe than the others found in the ravine, but they were still present, still unexplained. Semyon Zolotaryov, the mysterious World War II veteran who joined the trip at the last minute, had broken ribs, multiple fractures, and extensive internal bleeding in his chest cavity. Like Lyudmila, the trauma was massive and internal. Like her, his skin showed minimal corresponding external damage. Ozroshdeni's reports from the ravine victims are careful, measured, written in the bureaucratic language of Soviet medicine. But even through that careful prose, you can sense his confusion. These weren't injuries he'd seen before. The pattern didn't match known causes. One report contained a single line that conspiracy theorists have quoted for 60 years. The nature of these injuries is unclear and does not correspond to known causes of death in mountain accidents. And then there was Lyudmila's face. Her tongue was missing, not damaged, not partially present, completely gone, removed along with the muscle tissue of her mouth and throat. Her eyes were absent, the soft tissue around the eye sockets removed down to the bone. Portions of her lips were missing. The official explanation, added to the reports later, was scavenging. Animals. Natural decomposition. Bodies left in water, as the ravine had a small stream running through it, would naturally undergo decay. Scavengers would target soft tissue first, especially in spring when animals were hungry after winter. It's plausible. It makes sense from a forensic standpoint. Except for one problem. The other bodies found in the same ravine didn't show the same specific pattern of damage. Semyon was missing his eyes, but not his tongue. Nikolai and Alexander showed normal decomposition for the conditions, and time elapsed. If scavenging was the cause, if animals were feeding on the bodies, why was Lyudmila's damage so specific, so focused, so extensive? Some researchers have pointed to the high radiation levels found in the area and suggested chemical exposure. Others note that the tongue is highly vascular and might be damaged by certain types of pressure trauma or chemical agents. A few have proposed that the tongue was bitten off in a moment of extreme pain or terror, though this doesn't explain the surgical precision of the tissue removal. There's no consensus. Not among pathologists who've reviewed the case, not among forensic experts, not even among conspiracy theorists who've spent years studying every detail. But here's what we know with absolute certainty. 4 people found in a ravine in May 1959, all showing massive internal trauma with minimal external wounds. Injuries that a Soviet pathologist with decades of experience compared to shockwaves and extreme pressure. Damage patterns that didn't match falls, fights, avalanches, or any other natural disaster. The injuries fall into 2 distinct categories. 5 people who died primarily from exposure and hypothermia, with minimal physical trauma, and 4 people who suffered catastrophic internal injuries before or during their exposure to the elements. If everyone fled the same event at the same time, why do half the group have injuries consistent with extreme force, while the others show no physical trauma at all? Why is there such a clear division between those who were hurt and those who weren't? The weapons test theory offers an explanation. Distance. Some members of the group were directly in the path of a pressure wave from an airburst explosion. Others were far enough away to avoid the physical effects, but close enough to see and hear it, close enough to panic and flee. But if it wasn't a weapons test, if it was nature or accident or some other cause, then what created this exact pattern of injuries? What force shatters bones without breaking skin? What causes shockwave trauma on a mountain in winter? The questions remain unanswered. The official files offer no clear explanation, and the families of those 4 people found in the ravine have spent 60 years wondering how their loved ones really died. Chapter 4. The Radiation. Here's where it gets even stranger. The clothing recovered from some of the bodies tested positive for radiation. Not all of them. Specifically, the clothes belonging to Alexander Kolevatov and Yuri Krivonoshenko showed elevated radiation levels, enough that it was noted in the official reports, enough that someone decided it needed to be tested in the first place. The official explanation was straightforward. Krivonoshenko had previously worked at the Mayak nuclear facility, about 200 kilometers south. Mayak had been the site of a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster, one of the worst nuclear incidents in history. The theory was that he carried contaminated clothing or materials from his work. But think about the logic here. Why would investigators test for radiation at a hiking accident scene? This was 1959 Soviet Union. Radiation testing wasn't standard procedure. It required specific equipment, specific expertise, specific authorization. Someone suspected something radioactive was involved. Before they even got the results back, someone thought radiation was a possibility worth checking. And there's another detail that doesn't fit the contamination narrative. The radiation wasn't evenly distributed. It was on specific pieces of clothing, and it was beta radiation, not the type you'd expect from casual contamination over time. Chapter 5. The Orange Lights. While the search was ongoing in February and March of 1959, something else was happening in the skies over the northern Urals. Multiple witnesses, including some of the search and rescue teams, reported seeing strange lights, orange orbs, glowing spheres, objects moving across the sky that didn't behave like stars or planes. These weren't fringe reports from unreliable sources. They were documented in official Soviet archives. Weather stations logged unusual atmospheric phenomena. Military personnel filed reports. Local Mansi hunters described fireballs in the night sky around the time the hikers died. One particularly detailed account came from Georgy Atmanaki, a geologist who was in the area in February. He described seeing a bright sphere moving south to north, leaving a trail behind it. The object was visible for several minutes before disappearing behind the mountains. Another report from a collective farm worker described multiple sightings of orange lights throughout February and early March, always in the same general area where the hikers had been. Now here's the connection. The Soviet military was actively conducting tests in the region during this exact time frame. Missile tests, rocket launches, experimental weapons systems. Military logs that were declassified decades later confirm launches from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, with flight paths that would have taken them over or near the northern Urals. But there's more. The area around the Dyatlov Pass wasn't as remote as the official story suggested. It was close, uncomfortably close to restricted military zones. Chapter 6. The Secret Military Zone. The northern Ural Mountains in 1959 were not wilderness. They were a weapons testing ground. The Soviet Union, locked in the Cold War arms race, had designated vast swaths of the region for military use. Parachute mines, experimental explosives, rocket deployment systems, all of it happening in what was officially described as uninhabited territory. Parachute mines are particularly interesting when you look at the evidence from Dyatlov Pass. These weapons were designed to detonate in mid-air, creating massive pressure waves without traditional shrapnel. The idea was to destroy aircraft or damage infrastructure through concussive force alone. The effects of a parachute mine detonation match almost perfectly with what was found on that mountain. First, the bright flash and sound would cause immediate panic. Anyone in a tent nearby would flee instantly, not stopping to grab boots or coats. Survival instinct would override logic. Second, the pressure wave from an airburst explosion creates internal injuries without external wounds. The blast compresses the body, shattering bones and rupturing organs while leaving skin intact. Exactly what the pathologist documented. Third, the orange glow and fireball effect would match the witness reports of strange lights in the sky. And fourth, the Soviet military would have every reason to classify the incident immediately and bury any evidence connecting civilian deaths to weapons testing. There's precedent for this. Throughout the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States conducted weapons tests in areas designated as safe zones, only to discover later that civilians had been exposed. The difference is timing. If the Dyatlov group stumbled into an active test, the cover-up would need to be immediate. Chapter 7. The avalanche that came later. For decades, the official Soviet explanation was vague. A compelling natural force. That was it. No specifics, no detailed analysis, just nature. Then, in recent years, after international pressure and declassification efforts, a new explanation emerged. Avalanche. Specifically, a delayed slab avalanche triggered by the hikers cutting into the slope to pitch their tent. On the surface, it sounds plausible. Avalanches kill people. Mountains are dangerous. Case closed. Except the early investigators didn't mention an avalanche. The initial reports from February 1959 described the tent as intact, still standing, with relatively shallow snow coverage. Photographs from the scene show the tent poles upright, the structure preserved. Avalanches are catastrophic. They bury things. They destroy. A slab avalanche strong enough to cause the injuries found on the bodies would have completely buried the tent, snapped the poles, scattered equipment across the slope. That didn't happen. The avalanche theory also doesn't explain why the hikers ran downhill, away from the tent, over a kilometre away in some cases. If an avalanche had hit, bodies would be found near the debris field, not scattered in multiple locations down the mountain. And it certainly doesn't explain the radiation, or the lights in the sky, or the immediate classification of the files. The conspiracy theory argues that the avalanche explanation was introduced later, once the real cause could no longer be contained, as a way to satisfy curiosity without revealing classified military operations. Give people a natural explanation and they stop asking questions about what the government was doing on that mountain. Chapter 8. The Closed Files. The investigation into the Dyatlov Pass incident was opened on February 26, 1959, led by prosecutor Lev Ivanov. It was closed abruptly on May 28th. 3 months. For 9 deaths under mysterious circumstances, 3 months of investigation before the case was sealed and classified. Families of the victims were told not to ask questions. When they persisted, they were visited by officials who made it clear that continued inquiry would not be welcome. The message was simple: accept the official story, move on, forget. Certain documents from the investigation disappeared entirely. Autopsy photos that were referenced in reports were never found. Witness statements mentioned in summaries were not included in the final file, and key pieces of physical evidence, including cameras and film from the scene, were never returned to families or made public. The language used in the reports that do exist is deliberately vague. Injuries described as caused by an unknown force. Conditions at the scene noted as unusual without elaboration, and most tellingly, the conclusion that the deaths were not caused by other individuals, phrased in a way that carefully avoided saying what did cause them. Lev Ivanov, the prosecutor who led the case, remained silent about it for decades. Then, in 1990, he gave an interview. He stated that he believed the hikers had encountered something military. He described being ordered to close the case despite unresolved questions, and he mentioned the lights in the sky, the same ones documented in the reports, suggesting they were connected to whatever killed the group. By the time he spoke, the Soviet Union was collapsing. The incentive to maintain the cover-up was fading, but the files remained classified. Chapter 9. Zolotaryov's Mystery.
Yep.
Of all the people on that mountain, one stands out as an anomaly: Semyon Zolotaryov. He was 38 years old, nearly 2 decades older than most of the group, a decorated World War II veteran, and a relative outsider. He joined the expedition at the last minute, replacing someone who had dropped out. His background is unusually difficult to verify. Official records about his military service are vague. His movements in the years between the war and the hike are not well documented, and his presence on the trip raises questions. Why would a 38-year-old war veteran join a group of college students on a winter trek? What was his connection to them? And why did he carry a camera that was never recovered? Some conspiracy theories suggest Zolotaryov was a military observer, planted in the group to monitor something. Others propose he was intelligence, sent to document activities in the area. A few even claim he was the target and the others were collateral damage. There's no hard evidence for any of this. But the lack of information about him is itself suspicious. In the Soviet system, everyone had a file. Everyone's movements were tracked. The fact that Zolotaryov's history is so unclear suggests someone made it that way. His body was found months after the others, in May 1959, at the bottom of a ravine with several other members of the group. He had massive chest injuries, broken ribs, and was missing his eyes. The camera he'd been known to carry was never found in the evidence logs. Chapter 10. Why silence was necessary. Put yourself in the position of Soviet authorities in February 1959. 9 civilians are dead, killed during what appears to be a weapons test in a restricted area. The bodies show injuries consistent with experimental ordnance. There's radiation. There are witness reports of military activity, and the international community is watching. Admitting the truth would be catastrophic. Public trust in the government, already fragile, would collapse. Families would demand accountability. The Soviet Union's carefully maintained image of technological superiority would be undermined by the revelation that they'd killed their own people through negligence or accident. Internationally, the consequences would be worse. The United States and NATO would have propaganda material for years, evidence of reckless weapons testing, dead students, a cover-up. It would validate every criticism of the Soviet regime. And militarily, revealing what happened would mean revealing what they were testing. Parachute mines, pressure wave weapons, experimental delivery systems, all of it classified, all of it critical to maintaining strategic advantage in the Cold War. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Classify everything. Blame nature. Make the incident unremarkable. A tragic hiking accident. Nothing more. Control the narrative by controlling the information. Seal the files. Discourage questions. Wait for time to erase memory. And it almost worked. Chapter 11. The evidence that doesn't fit. Let's look at what the official explanations, avalanche or otherwise, don't account for. The tent was cut from the inside. This is not disputed. If an avalanche was coming, why cut the tent? Why not exit through the door? And if you're fleeing in panic from something outside, why take the time to cut multiple precise slashes instead of just running? The bodies were found in multiple locations spread over more than a kilometre. Some near a cedar tree, where they'd attempted to build a fire. Others in a ravine, 2 heading back toward the tent. This scatter pattern doesn't match a single catastrophic event like an avalanche. It suggests people fleeing in different directions, regrouping, then moving again. The injuries are divided into 2 categories. Some died from exposure, hypothermia, others died from massive trauma. If everyone fled the same event, why do half have injuries consistent with a blast or pressure wave, while others show no physical trauma at all? The radiation found on clothing was beta radiation, the type produced by recent nuclear reactions, not the ambient contamination you'd expect from someone who worked near a reactor months or years earlier. The lights in the sky were documented by multiple independent witnesses, including people who had no connection to the hikers and no reason to fabricate reports. These sightings coincided with confirmed military activity in the region. And perhaps most damning, the investigation was closed not because questions were answered, but because it was ordered shut. The lead prosecutor later admitted he believed something military was involved. Other investigators made similar statements decades later, once they could speak without repercussions. None of this proves a weapons test killed those 9 people, but it creates a pattern that fits the conspiracy theory better than any official explanation. Chapter 12. The Modern Investigations. In 2019, 60 years after the incident, the Russian government reopened the case. They announced new investigations, new analysis, modern forensic techniques applied to old evidence. The conclusion? Avalanche! But the new investigation relied entirely on surviving documents and photographs. No new physical evidence was examined because none exists anymore. The bodies were buried decades ago. The clothing and equipment were lost or destroyed. The scene itself has been altered by 60 years of weather and human activity. What the modern investigations did reveal was how little actual evidence remains. Key files are still missing. Photographs referenced in reports were never found, and certain witness statements that were supposed to be in the archives simply aren't there. Independent researchers have pointed out inconsistencies in the avalanche theory. Computer simulations show that the slope angle and snow conditions on February 1st, 1959 were not conducive to a slab avalanche. Meteorological data from the period doesn't support sudden temperature changes that could trigger a delayed avalanche. And survivor accounts from people who knew the hikers paint a picture of a group that was cautious, experienced, and aware of avalanche risks. The idea that they would pitch a tent in a dangerous location goes against everything their friends and instructors said about them. So why push the avalanche narrative now, 6 decades later? Perhaps because it's the only explanation that doesn't require admitting what really happened. Nature is a convenient scapegoat. It doesn't demand accountability. It doesn't require apologies, and it closes the case without opening old wounds. Chapter 13. The Pattern of Cover-Ups. The Dyatlov Pass incident is not unique. It fits into a broader pattern of Cold War-era incidents, where governments prioritise secrecy over transparency. In the United States, the radiation experiments conducted on unwitting subjects weren't revealed until the 1990s. In the Soviet Union, the Kyshtym disaster was hidden for decades. In both countries, military tests that exposed civilians to danger were classified and buried. What makes Dyatlov Pass different is the human element. 9 faces, 9 names, 9 families demanding answers. It's harder to bury a story when there are identifiable victims and grieving relatives. But the Soviet government tried. They sealed the files, they threatened the families, they constructed a narrative that satisfied just enough curiosity to make the questions go away. And for most people it worked. The Dyatlov Pass incident became a footnote, a strange mystery, something discussed by enthusiasts but not by serious historians. Until the files started leaking. Small details at first, a document here, a photograph there, witness statements that contradicted the official story. And slowly, over decades, a different picture emerged. Not of a tragic accident, but of a cover-up. Chapter 14. The Unanswered Questions. Even if you accept the weapons test theory, there are still questions. Why were the hikers in that area? If it was a restricted military zone, there should have been warnings, patrols, barriers. How did 9 college students wander into an active test site? One possibility is that the test wasn't supposed to happen that night. Military operations can be unpredictable. Weather delays, equipment failures, last-minute schedule changes. Perhaps the hikers were in an area that was usually safe, but on that specific night something went wrong. Another possibility is that the area wasn't clearly marked. The Soviet Union had vast territories under military control, and not all of them were properly secured. Remote regions relied on distance and harsh conditions to keep people out, not fences and guards. Or more disturbingly, perhaps the hikers were allowed to be there because no one expected a test that night. And when the test happened anyway, the decision was made to cover it up rather than admit the mistake. There's also the question of why some bodies showed severe trauma while others didn't. If a pressure wave from an explosion hit the area, you'd expect more uniform injuries. The division suggests people were at different distances from the blast, or that something else was happening simultaneously. And what about the missing tongue and eyes from Lyudmila Dubinina? Even if scavenging is the real explanation, the specificity of the damage is unusual. Scavengers typically go for soft tissue indiscriminately. The focused removal of the tongue has led some to speculate about chemical exposure or other environmental factors. These questions don't have answers, not in the official files, not in the declassified documents, and probably not in the still classified materials that may or may not exist. Chapter 15. The Human Cost. Behind every conspiracy theory, there are real people, real lives cut short, real families left without closure. Igor Dyatlov's mother spent the rest of her life believing her son died because of something the government did. She kept his room exactly as it was, waiting for answers that never came. She died in the 2000s, still convinced there was more to the story. Zinaida Kolmogorova's family was told not to speak publicly about the incident. When they tried to investigate on their own, they were discouraged, threatened, and eventually gave up. Lyudmila Dubinina's relatives were haunted by the nature of her injuries, the vague explanations, and the sense that they were being lied to. For these families, the conspiracy isn't abstract, it's personal. It's the difference between accepting a tragic accident and believing that their loved ones were expendable casualties in a weapons program that valued secrecy over human life. And that's what makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so compelling and so disturbing. If the conspiracy theory is true, it means 9 people died not because of bad luck or poor decisions, but because a government decided their deaths were less important than protecting classified information. Epilogue: the mountain still keeps its secret. Today, Dyatlov Pass is marked by memorials, plaques bearing the names of the 9 hikers, a simple cross on the mountainside. Visitors come to pay respects, to hike the same route, to stand where the tent once was and imagine what those last moments were like. The mountain is quiet now. Whatever happened there in February 1959 is long gone. The evidence scattered by wind and time, the witnesses either dead or silent. The truth, if it exists in any recoverable form, locked away in archives that may never be opened. Modern Russia has acknowledged that mistakes were made in the original investigation. They've admitted that files were lost or destroyed. They've reopened inquiries and commissioned studies. But the conclusions remain the same. Nature, avalanche, tragic accident. No mention of military activity. No acknowledgement of the lights in the sky. No explanation for the radiation, or the closed files, or the abrupt end to the investigation. And perhaps that's the real conspiracy. Not what happened on the mountain, but what happened after. The systematic erasure of information. The construction of a narrative that asks no difficult questions. The decision that closure matters less than secrecy. If you believe the official story, the Dyatlov Pass incident is a reminder of how dangerous the wilderness can be. A lesson about respecting nature and understanding your limits. But if you believe the conspiracy, it's something else entirely. It's evidence that governments will lie to protect themselves, that classified programs matter more than individual lives, and that some secrets are deemed too important to ever reveal, no matter who paid the price. The hikers left Sverdlovsk in January 1959 with dreams of adventure and achievement. They wanted to test themselves against the mountain, to earn recognition for their skills, to return home with stories of triumph over adversity. Instead, they became the story, a mystery that has outlived the Soviet Union itself, a conspiracy theory supported by evidence and contradicted by official denials. 9 people walked into the northern Urals, 9 people never walked out, and the mountain, indifferent to truth or lies, keeps watch over the place where they fell. Operation Snowblind, a weapons test that was never supposed to happen, a cover-up that was never supposed to crack, and a truth that may never be fully known. But the questions remain. Why did they run? What did they see? What force was strong enough to make experienced hikers choose certain death over staying in their tent? If the answer lies in a weapons test gone wrong, then the Dyatlov Pass incident is not just a mystery. It's a crime. One committed not by individuals, but by a system that valued power over people. And if that's true, how many other incidents were buried the same way? How many other deaths attributed to accidents were actually casualties of secret programs? How many families grieved without ever knowing the real reason their loved ones never came home? The mountain knows. The archives might know. But whether the truth will ever be told, whether justice will ever be served, whether the families will ever get real answers, that remains uncertain. What is certain is this. On a frozen mountainside in February 1959, something happened that the Soviet government could not allow to be explained. And decades later, despite investigations and declassifications and modern forensic analysis, that something remains officially unexplained. Make of that what you will. Thank you for listening. If this story grabbed you, please drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We love connecting with our community from around the globe, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more deep dives into the conspiracies and mysteries that refuse to stay buried. The truth is out there. Sometimes it's just buried deeper than we think. End. Echoes of Machiavelli, the journalist who found Tupac. The email arrived at 3 a.m. Ava Ramirez had been awake anyway, scrolling through decades-old forum posts about unsolved mysteries in hip-hop history, when her phone lit up with a notification that made her heart skip. The glow from the screen cast blue shadows across her cramped studio apartment in Los Angeles, illuminating the wall where she had pinned articles about cold cases and industry cover-ups. Empty coffee cups littered her desk. The city outside her window was silent, except for the occasional wail of a siren cutting through the darkness. The subject line was blank. The sender was a scrambled string of characters that looked like it had been generated by a random algorithm. But the message itself was crystal clear. Follow the eagle's shadow, Las Vegas, September 7th. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. She read it 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. September 7th. Everyone who knew anything about hip-hop knew that date. September 7th, 1996. The night Tupac Shakur was shot 4 times in a drive-by shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. The night that changed music forever. The night that spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories and launched an entire subculture of people who believed the most famous rapper in the world had faked his own death. Ava had covered music industry scandals for 7 years, clawing her way up from unpaid blog posts to a staff position at one of the most respected music journalism sites on the internet. She had exposed label corruption, uncovered ghostwriting schemes, and revealed the truth behind manufactured beefs designed to sell records. Her apartment walls were covered with printed articles bearing her byline, each one a small victory in a war against an industry that thrived on secrecy and spin. But this was different. This was the white whale. This was the story that could define a career or destroy it completely. She'd grown up listening to Tupac. Her older brother Marcus had been obsessed with him, playing All Eyes on Me until the CD was scratched beyond repair. When Marcus was killed in a drive-by shooting when Ava was 16, she had clung to Tupac's music like a lifeline, finding solace in the raw anger and vulnerability of someone who understood what it meant to live surrounded by violence. Investigating Tupac's death wasn't just professional ambition, it was personal in ways she had never admitted to anyone. She looked at the message again. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. What the hell did that mean? The first 2 phrases seemed obvious enough. 2 fates could refer to Tupac's alleged death versus his survival. 1 body could mean the body that was supposedly Tupac in the casket. But 1 jar? That made no sense. Was it metaphorical? Literal? Some kind of code? She screenshot the email and saved it to 3 different cloud services, then forwarded it to her encrypted backup account. If this was real, if someone actually had information about what happened to Tupac, she couldn't risk losing the only contact point. By sunrise, she had booked a flight to Las Vegas. By noon, she'd created a secure cloud folder and begun compiling everything she could find about that night in September 1996. And by midnight, she was convinced that someone out there knew something the rest of the world didn't. This wasn't a hoax. This was an invitation. The question was, an invitation to the truth, or an invitation to become another casualty in a cover-up that had lasted nearly 3 decades? Act 1. The Unsettled Record. The official story was simple enough. On September the 7th, 1996, Tupac Shakur attended a Mike Tyson boxing match at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. After the fight, he and Death Row Records CEO Marion Knight got into an altercation with a gang member in the casino lobby. Security footage showed the confrontation. Witnesses confirmed it happened. What came next was inevitable in the logic of gang violence and street justice. Later that night, Tupac and Knight were driving to a nightclub when a white Cadillac pulled up alongside their black BMW at a red light on Flamingo Road. Someone in the Cadillac opened fire. 4 bullets hit Tupac. 2 hit his chest, 1 his arm, 1 his thigh. Knight was grazed by shrapnel but otherwise unharmed. The Cadillac sped away into the night and was never found. Tupac was rushed to University Medical Center. He underwent multiple surgeries. His right lung was removed. For 6 days, he fought for his life in the intensive care unit while the world held its breath. Then, on September the 13th, 1996, at 4:03 in the afternoon, Tupac Amaru Shakur was pronounced dead. He was 25 years old. The killer was never caught. The case went cold. The official investigation stalled, and the conspiracy theories began almost immediately. Ava sat in her hotel room in Las Vegas, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, glowing with forum threads and archived news articles. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the desert heat that pressed against the windows. She had been researching for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, living on coffee and takeout from the casino buffets downstairs. The carpet smelled like cigarette smoke that had seeped in from the hallway. The walls were thin enough that she could hear muffled conversations and slot machine jingles from the casino floor below. The more she dug, the more questions emerged, spreading out like cracks in a windshield after impact. Why was there no public autopsy photo? Why was the casket closed at the funeral? Why did Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, cremate his body immediately after a private ceremony that excluded most of the media? Why were so many details about his final days kept under seal by hospital privacy laws that seemed unusually strict even by medical standards? She had created a timeline on the wall using tape and printed documents, connecting events with red string like something out of a detective thriller. It looked obsessive because it was obsessive, but obsession was what separated good journalists from mediocre ones. You had to be willing to lose yourself in the story, to let it consume you until the truth revealed itself. She found a Reddit post from June 5th, 2024, that had caught her attention during her initial research. The user claimed to have been tracking the online conspiracy community for years and had noticed something strange. The Tupac is Alive sites went deep in the archive. Malaysia, Cuba, a Navajo reservation. I saw movement. Movement? What kind of movement? She had tried to contact the user directly but received no response. The account had gone dormant shortly after that post, which was either suspicious or simply the natural life cycle of someone who had moved on to other interests. She started following the breadcrumbs. There were websites dedicated to photographic analysis, comparing tattoos on a man photographed in Belize to Tupac's documented body art. The comparisons were surprisingly detailed, noting the placement of his thug life tattoo across his stomach, the theatrical masks on his shoulder, the cross with his mother's name Afeni on his back. There were audio experts claiming voice pattern matches on recordings allegedly made years after his death, citing pitch analysis and speech patterns that they insisted were identical. There were sightings reported from 12 countries, each one detailed enough to sound plausible but vague enough to remain unverified. The persistence was what struck her. Nearly 3 decades after his death, people were still looking, still analysing, still believing. This wasn't just nostalgia or denial. This was something deeper, a cultural wound that refused to heal because it had never been properly examined in the first place. She decided to reach out to people who had actually known him, people whose credibility couldn't be easily dismissed. First, she contacted a former member of the Outlaws, Tupac's affiliated rap group. The man, who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity, told her something that stuck in her mind. They spoke on an encrypted video call at 2 a.m, the man's face partially shadowed to protect his identity. Behind him, Ava could see gold and platinum records hanging on the wall, relics from a different era. Pac was paranoid near the end, he said, his voice carrying the weight of old memories and older regrets. Not crazy paranoid, smart paranoid. He knew people wanted him dead. He talked about disappearing sometimes, just vanishing and starting over. We thought he was joking, you know. Pac was always talking big, always had some master plan he was working on. But looking back, maybe he was planning something. He asked me once what I would do if I had to start my life over with a new identity. I laughed it off. Now I wonder if he was testing the idea, seeing how people would react. Did he ever mention specific places he might go? Ava asked, leaning closer to her screen. The man shook his head. Not really, but he talked a lot about Africa, about going back to his roots. He mentioned Cuba a few times because of his stepfather's connections there, and he was fascinated by islands, isolated places where you could see people coming from miles away. He said cities made you vulnerable, too many angles of attack. Do you think he's alive? There was a long pause. The man looked away from the camera, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. I think Pac understood something most people don't, he finally said. Death is easy. It's living that's hard. If he wanted to disappear, if he wanted to become someone else, he had the resources and the intelligence to pull it off. Do I think he did it? I don't know, but I wouldn't bet against him. Pac always won in the end, even when it looked like he was losing. Next, she interviewed a music historian who specialised in 1990s hip-hop culture. The historian, a professor at UCLA named James Robertson, met her at a coffee shop near campus. He was in his 50s, dressed in a worn leather jacket and a vintage Public Enemy shirt, a man who had lived through the era he now taught about. His office, he had told her, was buried in boxes of vinyl records and archived interviews from the golden age of hip-hop. The Don Killuminati, the 7-day theory, Robertson explained, stirring sugar into his coffee with methodical precision, was released under the alias Machiavelli. That's a reference to Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher who wrote about political strategy and deception. One of Machiavelli's ideas was that faking one's death could be a useful tactic for escaping enemies and starting fresh. Tupac read extensively in prison. He knew this. He studied everything from Shakespeare to Sun Tzu, and he chose that exact alias for his posthumous album, which, by the way, was recorded in only 7 days. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. So you think the album title was intentional? Ava asked. That he was leaving a message? Robertson smiled. Tupac didn't do anything by accident. Every tattoo, every album cover, every lyric was carefully constructed to convey meaning. The man was a poet and a revolutionary, but he was also incredibly strategic. If you listen to the Machiavelli album, really listen to it, there are lines that feel like someone saying goodbye, but not the kind of goodbye you say when you're dying, the kind you say when you're leaving. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his notes. Listen to this. On the track titled Blasphemy, he says something about his enemies thinking they've won, but he'll be back when they least expect it. On another track, he talks about watching from the shadows. These could just be tough guy posturing, sure, but they could also be someone telling you exactly what they're about to do, hiding the truth in plain sight where no one will believe it. Ava made notes, her hand cramping from writing so fast. The pieces were interesting, but they weren't proof. They were the kinds of details that fueled speculation but didn't constitute evidence. She needed something harder, something tangible, something that couldn't be dismissed as interpretation or wishful thinking. That's when she found the police memo. Aced 2, a secret going cold. The document was buried in a batch of declassified Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department records released under a Freedom of Information Act request, filed by a journalist back in 2015. Most of the files were routine incident reports and administrative paperwork, the bureaucratic debris of a police department handling thousands of cases. But one memo stood out. It was dated September 14th, 1996, the day after Tupac's death was announced. The memo was addressed to the department's media relations office and contained instructions for handling press inquiries about the case. One line jumped off the page, highlighted in yellow marker by whoever had previously reviewed these files. No body photographs to be released under any circumstances, no public casket footage authorised. Family has requested complete privacy during viewing and service. Comply immediately. Ava stared at the screen until her eyes burned. The wording was unusual. Police departments typically release some kind of confirmation in high-profile death cases, even if just procedural details. Death certificates, cause of death, basic autopsy findings. but this seemed designed to create a complete blackout of visual evidence. The phrase, "comply immediately," suggested urgency that went beyond normal family privacy requests. She decided to visit University Medical Center herself. The hospital was a sprawling complex in downtown Las Vegas, a fortress of concrete and glass that loomed over the surrounding neighborhood. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Ava crossed the parking lot, heat radiating up from the asphalt in shimmering waves. Inside, the air conditioning was almost aggressive, cold enough to make her shiver after the blast furnace of the parking lot. The place had that universal hospital smell, antiseptic and floor wax, and something underneath that was probably fear and grief mixed together. Ava walked through the main entrance, trying to look like she belonged there, her press credentials tucked into her bag just in case, a folder full of fake paperwork visible in her arms to make her seem official. She found the records department tucked away on the second floor, down a corridor that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, one of them flickering intermittently. A security camera watched from the corner, its red light, blinking steadily. The door was marked "Medical Records, Authorized Personnel Only." She knocked and entered before anyone could tell her not to. Inside, a clerk sat behind a desk buried in manila folders and outdated computer equipment. He was in his 40s, balding, with the exhausted expression of someone who spent their days dealing with bureaucratic requests from lawyers and insurance companies. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting immediately to professional wariness. "Can I help you?" His tone suggested he very much hoped he couldn't. Ava put on her most professional smile and submitted a formal request for patient exit logs from September 1996, specifically for Ward B, where critical care patients were housed. She had prepared a story about researching hospital procedures for a medical journalism piece, but she never got to use it. The clerk looked at her request and shook his head almost immediately, not even pretending to check any systems. "Privacy laws," he said flatly, pushing the paper back toward her. "Medical records from that time period are sealed. Even patient logs. You'd need a court order or family authorization." "What if the patient is deceased?" Ava asked, knowing the answer but wanting to see his reaction. "Still sealed. Hospital policy." He crossed his arms, making it clear the conversation was over. "Even after almost 30 years? Ma'am, those records could stay sealed for 50 years or more. It doesn't matter how long it's been. Without proper authorization, I can't help you." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "And between you and me, some records are sealed for reasons that go beyond normal privacy laws. If you're asking about who I think you're asking about, that file has been flagged since 1996. Federal seal. That means someone in Washington decided no one gets to see it without going through them first." Ava felt a chill despite the stuffy warmth of the office. "Federal seal? For what reason?" The clerk shrugged. "Above my pay grade. Could be witness protection, could be national security, could be a dozen other things. All I know is that file doesn't exist as far as this department is concerned." She thanked him and left, frustrated but not surprised. She had expected resistance. The question was whether that resistance was standard procedure or something more deliberate. The mention of a federal seal was interesting. What would trigger federal involvement in a gang-related shooting? That evening, back in her hotel room, she began researching the online presence of conspiracy theorists who claimed to have evidence of Tupac's survival. One name kept appearing in forum discussions: Michael A., a man living in Belize who posted occasional videos online with his face blurred out, claiming he had encountered someone matching Tupac's description in the small island town of San Pedro years ago. Most people dismissed him as a crank seeking attention. But Ava noticed something in his videos. The details were too specific to be complete fabrications. He described the tattoos accurately, including ones that weren't widely photographed, like the smaller designs on Tupac's hands and the exact placement of every element. He knew about Tupac's mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when he listened, the specific cadence of his speech, the habit of touching his chin when he was thinking. Either this man had done extensive research that went beyond what any normal fan would attempt, or he had actually met someone who knew these details intimately. Ava made a decision. She booked a flight to Belize, leaving the next morning. She arrived in early July, stepping off the plane into air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through a wet towel. The small airport in Belize City was a chaos of tourists, locals, taxi drivers shouting destinations, and the overwhelming smell of tropical vegetation and saltwater. She had created a cover story. She was a travel writer doing a piece on Central American island culture. She didn't want to attract attention by announcing she was investigating Tupac sightings. The ride to San Pedro took her on a small ferry that bounced across turquoise water so clear she could see fish swimming beneath the hull. The town itself was a collection of pastel-coloured buildings on stilts, sandy streets where golf carts outnumbered cars, and an atmosphere of deliberate disconnection from the rest of the world. This was the kind of place people came when they wanted to disappear. She spent 3 days making casual inquiries at local bars and restaurants, nursing beers and striking up conversations with bartenders and shopkeepers. Most people were friendly, but unhelpful, offering the practiced vagueness of islanders who had learned not to ask questions about the tourists and expats who drifted through. A few locals seemed uncomfortable when she mentioned seeing an American man with tattoos who had been in the area years ago. One bartender told her, "People come here to disappear. We don't ask questions. Bad for business." But on her 3rd day, she met an older woman named Rosa, who ran a small guest house on Caye Caulker, a nearby island even more remote than San Pedro. Rosa was in her 60s, weathered by sun and salt, with eyes that had seen enough of life to be cautious but curious. They sat on Rosa's porch overlooking the water, drinking strong coffee, while pelicans dove for fish in the shallows. When Ava mentioned she was researching American expats who had settled in Belize in the late 1990s, Rosa's eyes lit up with recognition. "I remember one man," Rosa said carefully, as if testing each word before releasing it. "This was a long time ago, maybe 20 years or more. He stayed here for a few weeks, never gave his real name, just called himself T, paid cash always, very particular about that. Kept to himself mostly, but he was polite, good tipper, but you could see he was watching everything, you know, like a man who expects trouble." "What did he look like?" Ava asked, trying to keep her voice casual while her heart hammered against her ribs. Rosa leaned back in her chair, eyes distant with memory. Tall, strong-built, dark skin, and tattooed. Oh my God, tattooed everywhere. His arms, his chest. I saw them when he was swimming. He went swimming at night usually, when the beach was empty, and his face, I knew I had seen it before, on TV maybe, or magazine, but I couldn't place it. My daughter, she was maybe 15 then, she said to me one day, "Mama, that man looks like that rapper, the one who got shot." And I told her, "No, Mia, that man is dead." But after she said it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. "What happened to him?" Ava asked, leaning forward. Rosa shrugged, her expression darkening slightly. "He left one morning, early, before sunrise. I saw him go because I was up making breakfast. A boat came for him, not the regular ferry. Private boat, expensive looking. 3 men on it, all business. They didn't come to shore. He waded out to them with his bag held over his head. Then they were gone, heading south along the coast. I never saw him again." "Do you remember anything else? Anything he said, or anything unusual about his stay?" Rosa thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "One thing, he had a jar with him. Glass jar, like for preserving food, but sealed with wax. He kept it wrapped in a towel in his room. I saw it once when I was cleaning. Inside the jar was something dark, like ashes or dirt. I asked him about it, and he said it was sacred. From home, that's all he would say. One jar." Ava felt electricity course through her. The cryptic message from the anonymous email suddenly made more sense. One jar wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. But what was in it? And why was it important enough to mention alongside the other clues? Back in her hotel room that night, she reviewed documents she had obtained through less official channels. A source in Las Vegas, a former emergency services dispatcher who had helped her for a previous story about EMT protocols, had sent her copies of ambulance run logs from September 7th, 1996. Most of the entries were routine: heart attacks, car accidents, drug overdoses. Each one had a patient number, a timestamp, a basic description of injuries, and a destination. But one entry stood out like a sore thumb. Patient 1724, transferred, VIP code 3, no name recorded, personal effects, one sealed glass container, contents unknown, VIP code 3. Ava researched what that meant and found that it was a designation used for high-profile patients requiring maximum security and privacy. Celebrities, politicians, witnesses in federal cases, the kind of people whose presence in a hospital could create chaos if it became public knowledge. But why no name? Every other entry in the log, even other VIP cases, had at least initials or a case number that could be cross-referenced with hospital admission records. This one was blank, and the personal effects line, one sealed glass container, just like Rosa had described, just like the anonymous email had hinted at. What was in that jar? And why had it travelled with Tupac from Las Vegas to Belize? She compared the timestamp. The ambulance run for patient 1724 occurred at 11:17 at night on September 7th. That matched the time frame of Tupac's shooting. But the transfer notation was what caught her attention. Transferred where? And why would that detail be omitted from an official record? Ava sat at her laptop deep into the night, the sound of waves crashing on the shore mixing with the whir of her computer fan. She was getting close to something. She could feel it the way you could feel a storm coming before the first drops of rain fell. The pattern was there. The evidence was mounting. But she still didn't have the whole picture. She needed to understand who had the means and motive to help Tupac disappear. She needed to follow the money. She needed to find out what was in that jar. Act 3. The grounds for fake death. Ava returned to Las Vegas with more questions than answers, but at least now they were the right questions. She needed to understand the context better, to map the ecosystem of power and money and violence that surrounded Tupac in the weeks before his death. Who had the means and motive to help him fake his death? Who stood to gain, and who stood to lose? She started with Marion Suge Knight. Knight was the CEO of Death Row Records, the label that had made Tupac a superstar and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. He was also a former college football player with alleged ties to the Bloods gang, and a reputation for intimidation and violence that was legendary even by music industry standards. Stories about him were everywhere, dangling Vanilla Ice off a balcony to secure publishing rights, assaulting people at industry events, running Death Row like a criminal enterprise with platinum plaques on the walls. He had been in the car with Tupac when the shooting happened, sitting in the driver's seat of the black BMW that had rolled to a stop after the white Cadillac pulled alongside them at the red light. He had walked away with barely a scratch while Tupac had taken 4 bullets. That fact alone had made Knight a suspect in some conspiracy theories, people claiming he had orchestrated the hit over contract disputes and money. But Ava found that theory didn't quite fit when she really dug into the financials. Knight needed Tupac alive. The rapper was Death Row's biggest asset, bigger even than Snoop Dogg or the rest of the roster. His album sold millions. His cultural impact was immeasurable. All Eyes on Me had gone diamond. The Machiavelli album was tracking to go multi-platinum, even though it released after his death. Killing. Tupac made no financial sense when the man was actively generating tens of millions of dollars in revenue. But helping him disappear? That was a different calculation entirely. Ava spent a week in Los Angeles, digging into Death Row's financial records from that period. She pieced together information from court documents, bankruptcy filings that came years later when the label finally imploded, and interviews with former employees who were willing to talk now that Knight was serving time in prison for an unrelated manslaughter charge. The picture that emerged was troubling. Death Row Records in 1996 was a powder keg wrapped in platinum records. The label was bringing in massive revenue, but it was also bleeding money through mismanagement, legal fees, and what one accountant called off-book expenses that were almost certainly money laundering for gang operations. Federal investigators were circling, looking into racketeering and organised crime connections. The FBI had opened files on multiple death row executives. Gang affiliations that had once been useful for street credibility were becoming serious legal liabilities, and Tupac himself had been growing increasingly vocal about wanting to leave death row and start his own label. He had signed with death row while in prison, desperate for the $1 million bail Knight had posted. But now that he was out, now that he had fulfilled his contract obligations, he was looking for an exit. The problem was that Knight didn't let people leave. Not alive, anyway. Too many people knew too much about how death row really operated. What if the shooting had been real, but the death had been staged? What if Knight had seen an opportunity to get Tupac out of the line of fire, while also protecting the label's most valuable brand, and keeping federal investigators from getting their hands on a cooperating witness? A dead Tupac was worth more than a living one in some ways. No more legal troubles, no more unpredictable behaviour, no more risk of him testifying about death row's operations or jumping to a competitor. Just a legacy that could be monetised forever without any of the complications of dealing with the actual human being. Ava found something else interesting when she interviewed a forensics expert who specialised in death certificates and autopsy reports. The expert, a retired county coroner named Patricia Williams, who had handled thousands of cases during her career, agreed to review what little public information existed about Tupac's autopsy. They met at Williams' home in San Diego, a modest house filled with medical textbooks and forensic journals. Williams was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and sceptical by nature, someone who had spent a career dealing with families who didn't want to accept how their loved ones had died. "The thing about the Tupac case that always bothered me," Williams said, spreading out copies of the limited autopsy findings on her dining room table, "is that for such a high-profile death, there's remarkably little documentation available. Usually celebrity deaths get exhaustive examination because everyone wants to avoid even a hint of impropriety. But here, the full autopsy report was sealed, with only the most basic details released. That's unusual." "Could there be legitimate reasons for sealing it?" Ava asked. Williams nodded. "Sure. Family privacy, ongoing investigation, all the usual reasons. But it's been almost 30 years. Most sealed documents get released eventually, even if it takes decades. This one hasn't budged. That tells me someone with serious influence wants it to stay sealed." "What about the cremation? I've read that the body was cremated very quickly after the funeral." "Within 24 hours, Williams confirmed. "Again, not impossible, but fast. Cremation destroys all physical evidence. Once you burn a body, you can't go back and retest for toxicology, can't examine wound patterns, can't verify identity through DNA. It's final in a way that burial isn't. So if someone wanted to fake a death, cremation would be the way to do it?" Williams leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. "I'm not saying that's what happened, but if I were writing a manual on how to fake a celebrity death, yes, I would include immediate cremation on the checklist, along with a closed casket funeral, limited autopsy release and quick disposal of any physical evidence that could be independently verified later." Ava made detailed notes. The pattern kept repeating. Every procedural decision made in the days after Tupac's shooting had the effect of making verification impossible. Maybe that was coincidence, or maybe it was design. The funeral itself had been unusually private for someone of Tupac's celebrity status. The memorial service at the Frankie Campbell Funeral Chapel in New York was closed to media for the first hour, with only family and close friends allowed inside. Security was tight. enforced by men who looked more like bodyguards than funeral home staff. By the time reporters were permitted entry for the public viewing, the casket was already closed, sealed with brass screws. No one outside the immediate family ever saw Tupac's body except, allegedly, the medical examiner and the mortician. But Ava had found something interesting about that mortician. His name was Charles Henderson, and he had worked for the funeral home for 3 decades, handling services for everyone from mob bosses to mayors. She tracked him down to a retirement community in Florida, where he agreed to speak with her on condition that she didn't record the conversation. Henderson was 82 now, frail but mentally sharp. They sat in his small apartment while he drank iced tea and talked about a career spent preparing dead bodies for their final public appearances. "I remember the Shakur service," he said quietly. "How could I forget? It was chaos, security everywhere, family members crying, fans outside the building screaming. The pressure was intense to handle everything perfectly." "Do you remember preparing the body?" Ava asked, keeping her voice gentle. Henderson was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I signed confidentiality agreements, multiple agreements, more paperwork than I'd ever seen for a funeral service. They told me if I ever spoke about what I saw, I could be sued for everything I owned." "It's been 30 years, Ava said. "Whatever you signed probably has limitations." "Maybe." He looked out the window at the Florida sunshine, his expression distant. "All I'll say is this. In my career, I prepared thousands of bodies. I knew what gunshot wounds looked like. I knew what a body looked like after 6 days in intensive care, after multiple surgeries, after fighting for life and losing. And what I prepared for that service didn't match what the medical records described. That's all I can say. Draw your own conclusions." Ava's hands trembled as she wrote down his words. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough to confirm what she had begun to suspect. The body in that casket hadn't been Tupac. But if that was true, where was the real Tupac? And what did the jar have to do with anything? She found a possible answer in the culture of hip-hop itself. After extensive research and consultation with cultural anthropologists, she discovered that carrying ash or earth from your homeland was a practice in some African and Caribbean cultures, a way of maintaining connection to your roots even when far from home. Tupac's mother, Afeni, had been a Black Panther with strong ties to revolutionary movements and African spiritual practices. She had raised her son with a deep awareness of African heritage and the importance of maintaining cultural identity even in diaspora. What if the jar contained ash from somewhere significant to Tupac? What if it was part of a ritual, a symbolic carrying of his identity to his new life? In some traditions, carrying earth from your birthplace or a sacred place was believed to protect the traveller and maintain their connection to their ancestors. The anonymous emailer had mentioned it specifically. One jar. As if the jar itself was proof, evidence of the plan, a tangible object that connected the shooting in Las Vegas to the man in Belize to whatever life Tupac might be living now. If Tupac had truly planned to fake his death and start a new life, bringing that jar would make sense. It would be a way of carrying his true self into exile, a spiritual anchor in a life built on lies and false identities. Ava needed to find that jar. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of the escape plan. She continued tracking shipping records. After another week of tedious research, multiple Freedom of Information requests, and help from her source inside the port of Los Angeles, she found what she was looking for. In late September 1996, several large crates labelled Equipment Audiovisual Promo were shipped from Los Angeles to Panama City, Florida. The shipment was registered to a company called Eagle Shadow Logistics, a firm that had no website, no public business listings, and no record of existence after 1997. Eagle Shadow. The same phrase from the anonymous email that had started this investigation 3 months ago. The crates themselves were large enough to hold studio equipment, which made the shipment seem routine at first glance. Death Row regularly shipped recording equipment to various locations for promotional events and studio sessions. But Ava noticed something odd about the timing. The shipment was processed on September 10th, just 3 days before Tupac was officially pronounced dead, and the destination, Panama City, was a coastal hub with easy access to Central and South America by boat. The shipping manifest listed the contents as audio mixing boards, microphones, amplifiers, with a declared value that seemed suspiciously low for that much equipment. The total weight was listed as over 800 pounds, but the freight cost was minimal, suggesting someone with connections in the shipping industry had helped facilitate the transfer without too much scrutiny. She began to see the outline of a plan that was audacious in its scope but possible with the right resources and connections, and Marion Knight, whatever else he was, had both resources and connections in abundance. ECT-4, the escape plan. Ava constructed a timeline based on everything she had gathered. It was speculative, she knew, but it fit the available evidence better than the official story. September 7th, 11:17 at night. Tupac is shot 4 times in a drive-by shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. He's rushed to University Medical Center in critical condition. The shooting is real. The wounds are life-threatening, but he survives the initial trauma. September 8th and 9th, Tupac undergoes surgery. His right lung is removed. He is placed in intensive care. The official story says he remained in the hospital fighting for his life. But what if something else happened during this time? Ava found a notation in the hospital record she'd obtained, a single line that appeared in the ICU log for September 9th. Patient transferred to secure site. Identity withheld per federal protocol. Federal protocol. That suggested law enforcement or government involvement. Witness protection, maybe, or something less official. September 10th, early morning hours. Ava's theory diverged sharply from the official narrative at this point. She believed that Tupac was transferred out of University Medical Center under heavy security in the middle of the night. In his place, a body was prepared for eventual public display, a body similar enough in age and race to pass a cursory examination, but one that would never be subjected to close scrutiny because it would be cremated within days. The real Tupac, injured but stable, was transported to a private airfield outside Las Vegas. Ava had found a flight log that supported this theory. A small charter aircraft registered to an escrow company called Eagle Shadow Holdings departed from a private terminal at Las Vegas McCarran International Airport on September 10th at 6:15 in the morning. The flight plan listed the destination as Belize City International Airport. The passenger manifest showed 3 individuals, but their names were redacted in the copy she obtained. September 13th. Tupac Shakur is officially pronounced dead at University Medical Center. The announcement is made to the media. The world mourns. The conspiracy theories begin immediately, but most people dismiss them as grief-fueled denial. Meanwhile, if Ava's theory was correct, the real Tupac was recovering in a safe house in Belize, thousands of miles from the media circus and the gang violence that had nearly killed him. She returned to Belize in late July to follow up on the flight log. The private airfield where the plane would have landed was now defunct, converted to commercial use. But she tracked down a former air traffic controller who had worked there in the 90s. His name was Carlos, and he agreed to meet her at a cafe in Belize City. He was in his 60s now, retired, and seemed amused by her questions. "You're not the first person to ask about that time," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. There was a flight, September 1996. I remember because it was unusual. Middle of the night, no advance notice, and when the plane landed there were men with guns waiting. Security, I assumed. Private contractors. "Did you see the passengers?" Ava asked. Carlos nodded slowly. 3 people got off the plane. 2 were large men, bodyguards maybe. The third was smaller, wrapped in blankets, moving slowly like he was hurt. They put him in a car and drove away very fast. I never saw where they went. Did you see his face? No, but I saw his arm when the blanket slipped, covered in tattoos, very distinctive. I remembered thinking he must be someone important to have that kind of security. Ava felt a chill run through her. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was another piece that fit the puzzle. She also discovered something else during her research. In early 1997, just a few months after Tupac's death, a trust was established in Malaysia under the name Tariq Amaru. The trust documents, which she obtained through a contact in international finance, listed Tupac Amaru Shakur Trust as the beneficiary entity. The trust was designed to hold and distribute assets, including intellectual property rights and royalty payments. Tariq Amaru, almost an anagram of Tupac Amaru, too close to be coincidence. When she contacted the law firm managing the trust, she received a terse response. File sealed for privacy. No comment. Act 5. The risks of remaining dead. Ava sat in her apartment in Los Angeles, surrounded by evidence boards and timelines pinned to the walls. Papers were everywhere, spreading from her desk to the floor to the kitchen counter. Coffee cups formed rings on documents. Post-it notes covered every surface with questions, connections, and lists to follow. She had been investigating for 3 months now, and the weight of what she had uncovered was becoming overwhelming. She wasn't just chasing a conspiracy theory anymore. She was reconstructing what might be one of the most elaborate deceptions in modern celebrity history. But she kept asking herself the same question. Why? Why would Tupac choose to remain dead if he had survived? The answer, she realised, came down to survival and legacy. The threats against Tupac in 1996 were very real and came from every direction. The East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry had escalated from lyrical battles into actual violence, with shots fired at industry events and real blood spilled on city streets. The notorious Big, Tupac's childhood friend turned bitter rival, would be murdered just 6 months after Tupac's death, in a still unsolved shooting eerily similar to the one that had nearly killed Tupac. That murder would remain unsolved too, suggesting the same forces that wanted Tupac dead had succeeded with his former friend. Gang affiliations that had once been just street credibility had become serious liabilities. Tupac's association with the Bloods through death row records put him in the crosshairs of their rivals. His outspoken nature, his refusal to back down from confrontation, his tendency to turn every slight into a public feud, had made him enemies in the music industry, in law enforcement, and on the streets. He had been shot multiple times before the Las Vegas incident. He had been arrested repeatedly. He had served time in prison. The walls were closing in from every side. Staying dead meant staying safe. It meant his enemies would stop looking for him. It meant he could live out his life without constantly watching over his shoulder, without worrying that every corner he turned might be his last, without wondering if the next car that pulled up beside him would be the one that finished what the white Cadillac had started. There was also the matter of his commercial legacy. Tupac alive and aging would have been just another rapper trying to stay relevant in a changing industry, competing with younger artists, watching his influence fade as new styles and sounds took over. He would have had to deal with the mundane realities of a music career, contract negotiations, marketing decisions, the slow decline that came for every artist eventually. But Tupac, dead at 25, became immortal. His albums continued to sell millions of copies. Unreleased material was packaged and released for years after his death, generating revenue that would have made him one of the wealthiest figures in hip-hop if he had lived to collect it. His image appeared on t-shirts, posters, murals. His lyrics were quoted in college courses. He became more than a rapper. He became an icon, a martyr, a symbol of everything the culture represented. The question was, did he collect it? Ava found evidence suggesting that someone was managing Tupac's estate in ways that didn't quite make sense if he was actually dead. The Tariq Amaru Trust in Malaysia was just the beginning. She discovered real estate purchases in New Mexico under shell companies, with names that referenced Tupac's aliases and lyrics. She found bank transfers moving money through accounts in Cuba, a country where Americans were restricted from doing business, but where Tupac's mother, Afeni, had known political connections through her work with political refugees and revolutionary movements. One purchase in particular caught her attention, a property in rural New Mexico near a Navajo reservation, acquired in 1998 by a company called Machiavelli Holdings. The property was remote, off-grid, and completely private. Satellite imagery showed a compound with multiple buildings, solar panels, and enough land to be completely self-sufficient. Public records showed it was still owned by the same company, with property taxes paid regularly every year. Someone was maintaining that property. Someone was living there, or at least keeping it operational. Who was paying those taxes? Who owned Machiavelli Holdings? The corporate filings led to another shell company registered in Delaware, which led to another registered in the Cayman Islands, which led to another in Panama, creating a web of legal entities designed to obscure the ultimate owner. It was the kind of corporate structure used by people who had something serious to hide. Ava spent 2 weeks trying to unravel the ownership chain. She paid for specialised database searches. She contacted corporate attorneys who specialised in international business law. She followed money trails through offshore accounts and dummy corporations, and at the end of it all she found that the trail led back to a single point of origin, a trust established in 1997, just months after Tupac's death, with instructions that the beneficial owner's identity would remain sealed until the year 2045, nearly 50 years after the trust's creation. Who sets up a trust that locks identity information for 50 years unless they have something massive to hide? She also discovered something interesting about Tupac's posthumous releases. Between 1996 and 2006, 7 full albums of Tupac's music were released. Some were compilations of old material, remixes, and alternate versions of songs that had appeared on earlier albums. But others contained songs that had never been heard before. Tracks that nobody in the industry could account for based on known recording sessions. The official explanation was that Tupac had been incredibly prolific during his short career, recording hundreds of tracks that were being released gradually after his death, as his estate and label worked through the archive. Death Row and later Amaru Entertainment, the label Afeni had formed to control her son's legacy, claimed they had vaults full of unreleased material. But some audio engineers who analysed the posthumous tracks told a different story. Ava interviewed 3 different audio forensics experts, professionals who worked with law enforcement to verify voice recordings and detect audio manipulation. They pointed to subtle differences in recording quality, production techniques, and even vocal patterns that suggested some of the later tracks might have been recorded after Tupac's official death date. "Listen to the background noise on some of these tracks," one engineer told her, playing sections of a posthumous album through professional monitoring equipment. "The ambient sound signature doesn't match Death Row Studios or any other facility we can verify Tupac recorded at, and the vocal quality is different. Not worse, just different. Like he was recording in a different environment, maybe even using different equipment." Another engineer pointed out inconsistencies in Tupac's voice itself. The timbre and resonance patterns on some of these later tracks suggest his vocal cords had fully matured, that he had aged past 25. It's subtle, but it's there. The voice has more depth, more resonance in the lower registers. That's not something you can fake with production tricks. The theories were dismissed as conspiracy nonsense by most music industry professionals. Death Row and Amaru Entertainment released statements saying all the posthumous material had been recorded before Tupac's death. Music critics called the audio forensics claims pseudoscience. But Ava wondered if there was more to it. What if Tupac hadn't just faked his death? What if he had continued recording music in secret, feeding new material to his estate to be released gradually, maintaining his presence in the culture without revealing himself? It would explain how the posthumous releases kept coming year after year without the quality declining or the material running out. It would explain the inconsistencies the audio engineers had noticed. It would explain why his estate seemed so carefully managed, as if someone with intimate knowledge of his artistic vision was still making decisions about which tracks to release and when. It would be an extraordinary level of deception, requiring careful coordination between Tupac, his mother, trusted engineers and producers, and possibly even law enforcement or intelligence agencies. But then again, Tupac had been an extraordinary figure, a poet, an actor, a revolutionary thinker who had read Machiavelli in prison and understood that sometimes the greatest power came from appearing powerless, from being dead while actually alive, from controlling your legacy by removing yourself from it entirely. If anyone could pull off a deception that elaborate, it would be Tupac Amaru Shakur. Aced 6. The decision point. By late August, Ava had compiled everything she'd gathered into a comprehensive report that ran over 100 pages. She had the ambulance logs with their mysterious VIP Code 3 and personal effects listing. She had the shipping records for Eagle Shadow Logistics. She had the flight manifest showing a charter plane leaving Las Vegas for Belize the morning after the shooting. She had the trust documents from Malaysia. She had witness testimonies from Rosa in Belize and Carlos, the air traffic controller. She had the statement from Charles Henderson, the mortician who had prepared a body that didn't match the medical records. She had the audio forensics suggesting posthumous tracks were recorded after Tupac's death. And she had the strange gaps in the official narrative that had never been adequately explained. Most importantly, she had traced the mystery of the jar. The sealed glass container mentioned in the ambulance log, the jar Rosa had seen in Belize, the symbolic carrying of sacred earth from home. It all connected. The jar was physical evidence that tied everything together, proof that someone matching Tupac's description had travelled from Las Vegas to Belize carrying something deeply personal, something connected to his identity and heritage. She knew that publishing this story would make her a target. She knew that powerful people had reasons to keep the truth hidden, whatever that truth actually was. Death Row Records might be defunct, but Marion Knight still had connections. The people who had helped fake Tupac's death, if that's what had happened, wouldn't want their roles exposed. And if federal agencies had been involved, which the sealed files suggested, then she would be challenging forces far more dangerous than any record label executive. But she also knew that journalism existed for moments like this, for stories that challenged official narratives and forced difficult questions into the public sphere. This was why she had become a reporter, not to write puff pieces about album releases, but to uncover truth that powerful people wanted buried. She decided to do something bold. Rather than publishing a traditional article that could be ignored or dismissed, she would host a live-streamed presentation where she revealed her findings in real time, allowing the audience to see the evidence and draw their own conclusions. A live stream couldn't be stopped once it started. It couldn't be edited or suppressed by editors worried about lawsuits. And if thousands of people watched it happen in real time, the information couldn't be disappeared even if something happened to her afterward. She spent a week preparing. She created a PowerPoint presentation with scanned documents, photographs, and audio, clips. She rehearsed her delivery until she could present the entire investigation clearly and compellingly. She set up multiple backup servers to host the stream, knowing that whoever wanted this buried might try to take her offline. She notified several trusted journalist friends about the stream time, asking them to save copies in case her originals disappeared. The stream was scheduled for August 22nd, 2025, at 8 in the evening Pacific time. She promoted it on social media for 3 days beforehand with cryptic messages. The truth about Tupac Shakur. 29 years of lies end Thursday night. What really happened in Las Vegas? The anticipation built. Hip-hop forums exploded with speculation. Music news sites picked up the story. By the day of the stream, she had over 50,000 people registered to watch. The stream went live at 8 sharp. Within minutes, the viewer count climbed past 100,000. Within half an hour, it had gone viral, shared across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Reddit. News outlets started covering it in real time. By the time she was an hour into her presentation, Over 1 million people were watching. Ava sat in front of her camera, her apartment's evidence board visible behind her, and walked through her investigation step by step. She started with the anonymous email that had begun everything, explaining the cryptic message: "Follow the eagle's shadow, Las Vegas, September 7th, 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar." "I follow that shadow," she told the camera, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "And what I found raises questions that have never been properly answered about the death of the most influential rapper of his generation." She showed the ambulance log with patient 1724 and VIP code 3. She zoomed in on the line about personal effects: 1 sealed glass container. "This jar appears again in Belize," she explained, carried by a man matching Tupac's description, who told a guest house owner it contained something sacred from home. In some African and Caribbean cultures, carrying earth or ash from your homeland is a way of maintaining spiritual connection when in exile. Was Tupac carrying a piece of himself into his new life? She displayed the shipping manifest for Eagle Shadow Logistics, highlighting the timing. Equipment shipped from Los Angeles to Panama City 3 days before Tupac was pronounced dead. The same company name that appeared in the anonymous email. A company that ceased to exist after 1997. She played audio from her interview with the former death row security guard, his voice disguised for protection. "I heard someone mention extraction and Latin America branch. People don't use that language for moving studio equipment. They use it for moving people." She showed photographs of the property in New Mexico, obtained through public records requests and satellite imagery. A compound owned by Machiavelli Holdings, maintained for over 25 years, purchased through a web of shell companies designed to hide the true owner. Who's living there? Who's been paying the property taxes for a quarter century? She explained the web of trusts and offshore accounts, the money flowing through Cuba and Malaysia, the corporate structures designed for maximum secrecy. This isn't how you manage the estate of a dead celebrity. This is how you hide a living person's financial activity. She played the audio forensics analysis, letting viewers hear the subtle differences in vocal resonance on posthumous tracks. 3 independent audio engineers have told me these tracks show signs of being recorded years after Tupac's official death date. The music industry dismissed their findings, but science doesn't lie. She discussed the Belize sightings in detail, showing photographs Rosa had taken of the beach, where the tattooed man had swum at night. The testimony from Carlos about the mysterious flight and the injured passenger with distinctive tattoos. Multiple witnesses, decades apart, telling consistent stories about a man who looked like Tupac, had his tattoos, his mannerisms, his voice. Then she dropped the biggest bombshell, her interview with Charles Henderson, the mortician. She didn't show his face or use his name, but she quoted him directly. In his career, preparing thousands of bodies, he knew what gunshot wounds looked like, and what he prepared for Tupac's funeral didn't match the medical records. That's not speculation. That's the professional assessment of someone who handled the body. She paused, letting that sink in for her massive audience. "I am not saying definitively that Tupac Shakur is alive," she told the camera, looking directly into the lens. "What I'm saying is that there are too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies, too many pieces of evidence that don't fit the official story. Whether Tupac survived or not, something happened that night, and in the days that followed that we have not been told about. Someone went to great lengths to make verification impossible. The cremation, the sealed autopsy, the closed casket, the federal seals on hospital records. That's not how innocent people behave. That's not how you handle a straightforward case of gang violence." She ended with a direct appeal, her voice rising with passion. "If the most iconic figure in hip-hop history faked his death, it raises fundamental questions about truth, identity, power, and the manipulation of public narrative. These are questions we should be asking about our culture, about the industry, about what we believe and why we believe it. How many other stories have we accepted without examination? How many other legends are built on lies? And if Tupac Shakur did survive, if he's out there somewhere living under a different name, does he deserve the peace he's found? Or does the public have a right to know the Truth? The stream ended after 2 hours and 15 minutes. The chat had been scrolling too fast to read, thousands of messages per second. The viewer count had peaked at over 2 million people watching simultaneously. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with debate. Hashtags trended worldwide. Tupac lives, Machiavelli returns, Ava Ramirez. Some called her a hero for investigative journalism, a truth-teller who had done what mainstream media was too cowardly or compromised to attempt. Others called her a fraud peddling conspiracy theories for clicks, a clout chaser exploiting a dead man's legacy for personal gain. Major news outlets reached out for interviews. Her website crashed from traffic within minutes, even with the backup servers running. By morning, she had over 100 media requests in her inbox, and then the threat started. At first, they were generic trolling, the kind of harassment any woman with a public platform receives, but within 24 hours they became specific and credible. Her email inbox filled with anonymous messages warning her to stop digging, containing details about her daily routine that proved someone was watching her. Her home address was posted on multiple forums. Her social media accounts were flooded with harassment so intense she had to disable comments entirely. Someone sent her a package at her apartment building. When she opened it, she found a printed photo of her building taken from across the street, with a red X drawn over her window in marker. No note, no explanation, just the image and the implication. 2 days after the stream, her website was hit with a massive distributed denial of service attack that took it offline for 3 days. Her hosting provider told her it was one of the most sophisticated attacks they had ever seen, originating from multiple countries simultaneously, using methods typically associated with state-sponsored hacking groups. This isn't random hacktivists, the security specialist told her. Someone with serious resources wants you silenced. Most troubling of all, her contact in Belize, Michael Agas, went completely silent. His videos stopped appearing online. His email bounced back with a message saying the account didn't exist. When she tried to reach out to mutual contacts in San Pedro, they told her he had left the country suddenly, in the middle of the night, leaving his belongings behind. One person said they'd seen men in suits asking about him at the bars where he used to hang out. Another said they heard a boat had picked him up from the beach and headed south toward Guatemala. Rosa, the guest house owner who had told her about the tattooed man with the jar, stopped returning her calls. When Ava finally reached her daughter, she was told, "My mother says she doesn't want to talk anymore. She says the past should stay in the past. Please don't contact us again." Carlos, the air traffic controller in Belize City, sent her a single text message. "They know I talked to you. I'm sorry. I can't help anymore. Delete my number." One by one, her sources were disappearing or being silenced. Ava realised she'd kicked a hornet's nest. Someone was very interested in making sure her investigation didn't go any further. The question was, who? And how far would they go to protect a secret that was almost 30 years old? She didn't sleep for 3 days after the stream, jumping at every sound in her apartment building, checking the locks on her door obsessively, keeping a baseball bat by her bed. She knew she should be scared. She was scared. But she also felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. She had done something that mattered. She had asked questions that needed asking, and whatever happened next, at least she had told the truth as best she could determine it. Or at least she had raised enough doubt about the official story that people would never look at Tupac's death the same way again. Epilogue. It was late September now, almost exactly 29 years since Tupac had been shot on the Las Vegas Strip. Ava sat in a hotel room in Miami, far from her apartment in Los Angeles, which no longer felt safe. The room was generic, the kind of anonymous space that existed in every city. Beige walls, generic art prints, the smell of industrial cleaning products trying to mask decades of previous occupants. She had checked in under a fake name, paid cash, and told no one where she was going. She had backed up all her files to secure cloud storage, encrypted everything twice, and shared copies with 3 trusted journalists she had worked with over the years, people who would publish the material if anything happened to her. She had written detailed instructions about where all her sources were, how to verify the evidence, who to contact if she went silent. It was the kind of preparation you made when you knew you had become a target. The threats hadn't stopped. If anything, they had intensified. But she was still alive, still working, still digging. That had to count for something. She opened her laptop and scrolled through Reddit threads, watching the conspiracy community react to her revelations. The discussions had exploded across multiple forums and platforms. The documentary subreddit had a mega thread with over 15,000 comments analysing every piece of evidence she had presented. Hip-hop forums were debating whether the audio forensics proved anything, or were just wishful thinking dressed up as science. True crime communities were cross-referencing her findings with other cold cases, looking for patterns. People were sharing their own theories, their own sightings, their own pieces of evidence that they claimed supported her investigation. Some of it was ridiculous, the kind of obviously fabricated stories that conspiracy theories attracted. But some of it was intriguing. Detailed accounts from people who claimed to have seen someone matching Tupac's, description in various locations over the years. All of it showed how deeply Tupac's death, or alleged death, had impacted the culture. One thread caught her attention. It was titled Pack in Cuba, Pack in Malaysia, Pack in New Mexico, Mapping the Sightings. Users had created an interactive map showing every reported Tupac sighting since 1996, colour-coded by credibility and cross-referenced with the evidence Ava had presented in her stream. Green markers indicated high-credibility sightings with multiple witnesses or photographic evidence. Yellow markers were possible sightings with limited verification. Red markers were obviously false claims. The map showed clusters in Central America, Southeast Asia, and the American Southwest. The pattern was too consistent to be random chance, but too scattered to prove anything definitive. It was like looking at a constellation and trying to decide if the stars formed a picture, or if your brain was just imposing order on chaos. Ava clicked on a green marker in New Mexico, not far from where she had identified the Machiavelli Holdings property. The entry described a sighting from 2012 by a local artist who claimed to have met a man at a Navajo reservation who looked remarkably like Tupac, though older and quieter. He spoke about hip-hop like someone who had lived it, the artist wrote. Not like a fan, but like someone who had been in the middle of it all. He mentioned the East Coast, West Coast thing with this sadness in his voice, like he was talking about old friends who had died. When I asked his name, he said to call him Amaru. I didn't think anything of it until later. Amaru, Tupac's middle name, the name used for the Malaysian Trust. A breadcrumb or a coincidence? She switched to a different tab, reading through emails from people who had watched her stream. Most were supportive, thanking her for her courage and her journalism. Some were from people claiming to have additional evidence, though most of those led nowhere when she followed up. A few were from music industry insiders, speaking off the record, telling her she was onto something but to be careful because people had disappeared for asking fewer questions than she had asked. One email stood out. It had arrived that morning from an address that appeared to be randomly generated. The subject line was blank, just like the original anonymous email that had started everything. The message was brief. The jar is still sealed. Some truths are buried for good reason. You've done your part. Now let the legend rest. She stared at the message, trying to parse its meaning. Was it a threat? A warning? Or confirmation from someone who knew the truth? Ava opened her journal, a physical notebook she kept for her own thoughts separate from her digital files. The pages were filled with 3 months of notes, observations, questions that still had no answers. She turned to a blank page and began to write, her hand moving across the paper in the dim light of the hotel room. 3 months ago, I received an anonymous email that changed everything. Follow the eagle's shadow, it said. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. I followed that shadow as far as I could, and I found evidence of something extraordinary. Not proof, but evidence. Enough to know that the official story doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Enough to know that powerful people wanted this buried. Enough to know that the truth, whatever it is, has been hidden for nearly 3 decades. Did Tupac Shakur survive September 7th, 1996? I don't know. I may never know for certain. But I know this. Machiavelli lives in the questions we're afraid to ask, in the narratives we accept without examination, in the spaces between what we're told and what we're allowed to know. He said Machiavelli lives, and if he does, we owe him the truth. Not the comfortable lie of martyrdom, not the sanitized legend of a fallen icon, but the messy, complicated, dangerous truth of a man who might have chosen to disappear rather than die. That truth is worth fighting for, even if it costs me everything. She closed the journal and looked out the hotel window at the Miami skyline. The city glowed in the darkness, millions of lights representing millions of people, each one living their own version of truth and lies. Somewhere out there, in Belize or Malaysia or New Mexico or Cuba or 1,000 other places, someone might be living under a different name with a different face, with the same tattoos and the same voice and the same fire that had made Tupac Shakur immortal even before his alleged death. Or maybe he really was gone, and she had spent 3 months chasing shadows and connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture. Maybe the pattern she had found was just the human mind's desperate attempt to impose meaning on chaos, to find conspiracy in tragedy, to believe that someone as vital and alive as Tupac couldn't simply be snuffed out by random violence on a Vegas street. Either way, the investigation had revealed something important, that in an age of information and surveillance it was still possible to disappear. It was still possible to control your own narrative, even from beyond the grave. It was still possible to become legend by choosing when and how your story ended, by taking yourself out of the equation and letting the myth grow in your absence. Her phone buzzed with a new email notification. She checked it, expecting another threat or another journalist looking for an interview or another conspiracy theorist claiming to have the missing piece of the puzzle. Instead, it was from the same scrambled sender who had contacted her back in May, the one who had sent the original invitation to follow the eagle's shadow. The subject line was still blank. The message contained only 3 words, no signature, no explanation. He sends regards. Ava stared at the screen, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she screenshot the message and saved it to her encrypted backup. She didn't know if it was real or another layer of deception. She didn't know if she should feel validated or terrified. She didn't know if he meant Tupac or someone else entirely. Someone using the legend to manipulate her, to keep her chasing ghosts while the real truth stayed hidden. She didn't know anything for certain anymore, except that certainty itself might be the biggest lie of all. But she knew she couldn't stop now. Stopping meant letting them win, whoever they were. Stopping meant accepting that some truths were too dangerous to pursue, that some questions were better left unasked. And she hadn't become a journalist to accept comfortable lies. She had become a journalist to make people uncomfortable with the truth. She opened a new document and began typing the outline for her next investigation, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her mind already racing ahead to the next lead, the next question, the next shadow to follow. She would dig into the Malaysian trust, try to find someone who knew who had set it up. She would visit the New Mexico property, see if she could get close enough to observe who was living there. She would follow the money trails she hadn't had time to fully explore, trace every dollar that had flowed through Tupac's estate in the years since his death. Because that's what journalists do. They chase the truth, wherever it leads, whatever the cost. Even when the truth refuses to reveal itself clearly, even when the answers create more questions, even when powerful forces want them to stop asking. And sometimes, if they're very lucky or very unlucky, they find something that changes everything. Outside her window, the sun was setting over Miami, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple, colours so vivid they looked artificial. like someone had turned up the saturation to make the world seem more beautiful than it really was. In the distance, she could hear sirens, the ambient soundtrack of urban life, emergency and crisis and human drama playing out in 1,000 small ways across the city. In her earbuds, an old Tupac track played softly, the one from the Don Killuminati album, the one where he rapped about death and rebirth and revenge from beyond the grave. The lyrics seemed to take on new meaning now, as if he had been telling everyone exactly what he planned to do, and no one had believed him because the truth was too outrageous to accept. He had studied Machiavelli in prison. He had learned that the greatest trick was making your enemies think they had won. And maybe, just maybe, he had pulled off the greatest trick of all. Machiavelli lives, he had said, and maybe, just maybe, he was right. Not as the 25-year-old rapper frozen in time by bullets and legend, but as something else, something transformed, something that had chosen to become myth rather than remain mortal. The track ended, and another began, his voice filling her ears with words about thug life and enemies, and surviving against impossible odds. She let it play, let the poetry wash over her, and wondered if somewhere in those lyrics was another clue, another breadcrumb on a trail that might lead nowhere or might lead everywhere. She would keep looking, keep asking, keep digging, even if it took another 3 months or 3 years or 3 decades, because the story wasn't over. It might never be over. And that was okay. Some stories weren't meant to have endings. They were meant to keep unfolding, generation after generation, truth mixing with legend until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. That was Tupac's real legacy, she realised. Not the music or the movies or the revolutionary politics, though all of those mattered. His real legacy was teaching an entire culture to question the official story, to look for the truth beneath the surface, to never accept simple answers to complicated questions. He had made skepticism hip, and in doing so, he had created the conditions for his own possible resurrection, because a culture trained to question everything would never stop questioning whether he was really gone. Fade to black. Archival footage plays, showing the flashing lights of an ambulance reflecting off wet pavement on a desert road late at night, September the 7th, 1996. The beginning of a mystery that might never be solved. A legend that would outlive whatever truth had been buried beneath it. The camera lingers on the lights, red and white and blue, pulsing against the darkness like a heartbeat, like proof of life, like a signal to anyone watching that something happened here that changed everything. Then slowly, inexorably, the lights fade to nothing, leaving only darkness and the sound of breathing, of waiting, of questions that echo into silence without answers. But in that silence, if you listen closely, you might hear something. A voice, distant and distorted, rapping about living forever, about being more than flesh and bone, about becoming legend. Or maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's just your mind creating patterns where none exist, hearing what you want to hear because the alternative is too painful to accept. Either way, the mystery endures, the questions remain, and somewhere, maybe in Belize or Malaysia or New Mexico or nowhere at all, Machiavelli might be smiling at how well the plan worked. End.